Something I hear often in Warcraft circles is calls to bring war back to Warcraft. At the surface, it seems like a confusing request. After all, we have constant wars. Every other year, or every year sometimes, we have constant war with one thing or another. The Burning Legion, the Scourge, the Old Gods. We are constantly at war. See, what people actually mean when they say that is this war between humans and orcs, because gods forbid we move on from one very specific plot. As Blizzard has proven time and again, they don't know how to actually write a war, because usually it goes, the Horde does something stupid and villainous, and the Alliance defends itself, but we pretend both sides are equally in the right. I love the Horde as much as the Alliance, but they are written very stupidly whenever a war starts. See, I do want war in Warcraft, but I want deeper ramifications of it, storylines that reflect the realities of war, and most importantly, the key topic of today's video, and that is the logistics of war in a fantasy universe. All too often when a war happens in a fantasy setting, all that the fantasy part does is maybe we get some magical units flinging fireballs instead of shooting guns. Maybe, like in Warcraft 3, those magical units have very specific spells, be they damage or utility. But while the magic is there on the ground, and the magnitude of things they can do implies that magic can be really powerful, the more large-scale ramifications of having real, powerful magic are rarely ever considered. Because think about some things that magic users in fantasy settings can do. And I will mostly use Warcraft and D&D examples because they are the two systems I'm most familiar with, but I know these are not exclusive to them. Consider this. In D&D, a 5th level cleric can use a 3rd level spell slot to conjure food and water. Sure, there isn't a very huge amount of those clerics, and they can do this once per day, but there are ways of subverting those limitations. Gather a few of those clerics, or power level them, or do some of the metagaming tricks to replicate the spell more often, and you suddenly have an abundance of food. In Warcraft, mages who can conjure food and water are even more common. Suddenly, just like that, food scarcity is gone. The population shifts from the majority agrarian and starts heavy urbanization. This frees a lot of hands from menial labor and starts shifting them into industry, science. The society makes a huge jump in advancement due to a fairly low level spell. Also, medieval style sieges are gone. You can't just sit outside the walls and wait for people to starve and surrender, because they can just conjure more food. Supply lines in war suddenly disappear. You can't cut off the supplies for an army because their clerics or mages can either conjure more food or teleport around with the food or weapons. Armies have to go into either heavy siege weaponry or magical weaponry that can break down walls, or no one is ever getting conquered. And we know the laws wouldn't allow that. In another standard fantasy imagery moment, we have those lords, those high-born nobles ruling due to their descent. And in the real world, they did, because here, power comes from status, from influence. As much as any indie musician whose parents' name are blue on Wikipedia can attest, being born to parents with existing influence does a lot for you. But in a magical world, with mages and priests holding real power, being able to warp reality with words and funny dances, how long and how often would those lords stay in power? Sure, a lord can convince 100,000 peasants to swarm the much less numerous peasants, and eventually even they would get beaten down. But what the lord can do with influence, the mage can do with magic. He can charm the masses with a spell, or just drop a huge fireball on everyone. Honestly, if mages were real, they would be running things as often, if not more, than the lords and nobles. Education would hold real power over bloodlines. Meanwhile, in most fantasy settings, an occasional magocracy is very rare. This is not to say there wouldn't be a societal prejudice against magic and mages, like the kind of prejudice we have in the real world against anyone who is slightly different and who has some special magical powers, and not necessarily magical. We have a lot of prejudice in the real world, and of course there would be prejudice in a magical world, but that prejudice would be really different when all of those things are real. Because in the real world, the prejudice against magic was used to persecute people who were your political opponents, or people who would be dangerous to your status and influence. Meanwhile, if the magic is real, the mages can manipulate the masses to their advantage just as much. Sure, there would still be prejudice against mages from one side, but the mages could also create prejudice against people who are their opponents and claim that people who don't have magic are worse because clearly the gods have favored the people with magic, and if you don't know how to do it, clearly those people are the worst people. I know there's ways to explain and justify why things don't change. You can just say, oh, in my version, even the low-level clerics and mages are very rare. These things are very minuscule, if any, influence over how the world looks. Or, there is a god of invention who limits invention, because I can't stress how stupid the thing with the gaunt forbidding gunpowder is. I have talked about this in the previous videos. Look up some of the previous videos to see what I'm talking about. Sure, you could do that, but that is lazy and boring. Why try to keep the world unchanged and virtually identical society to the real world? You took the world with magic and gods. Now live with the implications of it instead of working against the core principles of the thing you accepted. Besides the things I already talked about, such as food conjuration and teleportation, invalidating a lot of medieval and even modern warfare rules, there are some new things the magic can allow to happen in fantasy warfare. Things that I don't see coming up. If you know fantasy settings that do these things well, do let me know. One of my favorite things to do with my fantasy warfare is weather magic. Think about it. A single mage in Warcraft can cool down a blizzard over a small area. What if we get together a small squad of wizards? Instead of just shooting fireballs like a much less armored modern infantry, the wizards can pool together their magic and cool down a massive blizzard over the whole battlefield. They see orcs charging in, and they know the orcs are dressed more lightly than their knights and come from warmer climates, so the mages cool down the cold weather to impede the whole enemy army. Meanwhile, orcish shamans on the other side are trying to either clear the weather or they notice the human knights wear a lot of metal. So they try to cool down a thunderstorm that will strike the armor and take the knights down. And suddenly you have these two weather fronts pushing against each other everywhere there is a battle. This isn't limited to real weather either. I recently had Nylon Ragecasters, basically Pitlord minions, long story, cooling down a literal rain of fire on a place they invaded. Not a small circle over a few characters. A whole countryside blanketed with fireballs coming down from the sky, firestorms raging from the after effects of that. Void magic users could summon an obscuring dark fog that they can of course see through, and even if they couldn't, that still gives them a strategic advantage in stopping an enemy advance. Another thing a lot of armies depend on in the real world is terrain advantage. Either it's the familiarity with the terrain or just having certain terrain formation. High ground advantage, choke points, these things can help you defend, limiting the way the enemy armies have of firing at you, and allowing you to funnel them into narrow positions to come to you. But if you have a lot of magic users, you can raise that terrain and create choke points. You can quickly conjure trees or rocks to give yourself a better defensive position. You know how ancient Romans were renowned for basically building a whole camp overnight? And they didn't even need magic to do this. With actual elemental casters, they could literally raise rocks right in front of them to gain a defensive advantage. Or suddenly create a swamp to moor enemy siege weapons in place and stop them from advancing. You know what else rarely comes up? Disease. Not just people getting sick as a result of these other actions, but magically procured and specially created diseases. We can basically get chemical and biological weapons centuries, if not millennia earlier. We did ban those kinds of weapons pretty quickly in the real world, but who knows if we would still consider them so reprehensible if it was, say, Romans or Assyrians, who are much more brutal in warfare than we are today, if they came up with them and used them more frequently. Because you can't tell me the Assyrians, the ancient Assyrians, would have issues with dropping some chemical weapons or some diseases on an enemy army. Counterpoint to disease is disease prevention. I hear this might be a controversial topic, but this is a real historical topic that really comes up. Because you know how when the Europeans came to America, how they spread European diseases across the American continent and caused, a lot of deaths. Not accidentally, but they caused a chain of events that led to a lot of deaths, even if they didn't have personal hands in it. But now imagine the Native Americans had actual magic. Imagine they didn't have to depend on just natural medicine and herbs and whatever medicine that they could, the natural medicine like we have in the real world. Imagine if like Native American shamans, if we can call them that, had real magical power to cure diseases. Even if the Native Americans had no resistance to the European diseases, even if a lot of people would probably still die because magic users can't be everywhere, even if a lot of people would still die, it would be a lot less people would die than they did in the real world. America wouldn't be such a ghost town. It would still be a lot of people, a lot of still intact civilizations and cultures by the time Europeans start to get really deep into the continent. The colonization of the American continent would be much slower and much weaker than it was in the real world. It would be much closer to how Africa was colonized. Perhaps it would also be delayed as much, or perhaps it would still be faster due to, I don't want to use words that might trigger YouTube, due to very bad people like Hernan Cortés, still abusing people and just frankly killing people. I said another bad word for YouTube. If people like Cortés would still be able to influence and manipulate people, but the diseases later wouldn't kill as many people, so the conquest and the colonization of the Americas would be much slower. That again changes the world in ways that fantasy writers seem to not really consider. Like, imagine if not only like if the ghost shirts of the Lakota and other indigenous nations of the Great Plains, it's like, imagine the ghost shirts really worked, and by enchanting a shirt with real magic, if they could really actually stop bullets. Imagine if the Aztec priests, Aztec is not what they call themselves, so it's like politically incorrect today to call them Aztecs. If the Mexica, imagine if the Mexica priests could actually cast magic by sacrificing people. And not just sacrificing people, but having the same kind of magic users that the Europeans have in this world. The fighting field would be much more even and would change the world in unpredictable ways. Well, predictable, but very different from what we know. So it's not just creating disease that really changes how the world works and how the warfare works, but preventing disease also changes that warfare, because now these populations that were underdogs in real history now can fight back much better, with better weapons, so to speak, than they had in the real world. Of course, all of those things have devastating effects on the environment. If a bunch of people coming together can suddenly make a place much warmer or much colder, even if it is for a short time, or if they can shift weather patterns violently, or just create swamps or forests out of nowhere, it destabilizes environments. Habitat loss, climate change, disease, all of those things we are struggling with now come much earlier and much faster. And that also has to be considered when you think about the ramifications of large-scale magic in a world. That goes a little bit outside of the topic of fantasy warfare, but if you start including these elements, you have to realize what they do to the world. Perhaps there are fantasy settings that consider these implications, but unless they are focused on the warfare, like specifically a war game, the writers rarely really think about it. Or at the very least, I haven't encountered a lot of them. So if you do know fantasy settings that do this well and embrace the implications of magic in their world, do let me know in the comments below. Meanwhile, I think this is it for this topic, and next time we will go back to more potential future WoW classes. There is a poll up in the channel right now, so if you want to have a say in what comes up next, you have that option right now. And as always, like and subscribe to stay up to date with the latest videos, and I hope to see you next time.